Hello, and welcome back to another episode of You Are Not Your Diagnosis. Today's episode is going to be an exploration of why it is so challenging to start new habits, to make changes in our lives, even though on many levels we know in our minds that these changes are good for us. It can be really, really challenging. And I think this is, again, an episode that's relevant for anyone, not just those who are dealing with chronic illness, because we all want to make changes in our lives. We all want to do things that support our health and our healing, and yet we find ourselves struggling with them. So in today's episode, I really want to talk about why that is. And I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the science of our brains and how we're hardwired, especially from an evolutionary perspective over time, how our brain was initially designed and how that kind of sabotages us now. And then more importantly, I want to talk about what can you do to get past these challenges that we have because of our wiring in our brain. But first, just take a moment to think of the last time that you tried to start something new, some new habit in your life. So maybe this was you wanted to start exercising. Maybe this was you wanted to start a meditation practice. You wanted to change your diet. You wanted to become a more positive person, whatever that is. And think about then, and this is not to blame or shame you, I just want you to honestly think, when you tried to make that change, how easy was it and how successful were you? And so this episode is going to maybe shed a little bit of light on why you might have struggled, because struggle is very common. I have struggled with things in my life. I've struggled to make new habits and changes. It's very common, if you think of our society in the Western world of making New Year's resolutions, and yet how few people those resolutions really last for very long. I think back of, going to the gym, and I've been a consistent gym user. Now I don't go to the gym, I work out, I do something else at home. But I was always somebody who consistently went throughout the year. And I always remember in January, there was this whole influx of people, and it was really hard to get machines and to be able to exercise. And yet within probably 3 weeks to a month, everything kind of died down and went back to the way it used to be. So that's just kind of a beautiful example of what happens is, people are making resolutions with good intentions. You're wanting to make a change, often because it's going to improve your health and well-being. And yet it becomes very challenging to follow through on that resolution. And so we find ourselves again back in that pit of, I exercised for a week or two after New Year's and then I stopped. It was too hard. It was too challenging. So I hope this episode is going to give you some insights into why that really happens. And it's not just you, and it's actually how we're wired. And more importantly, what can you start to do to kind of hack those patterns in the brain and make some changes? So let's talk about why the brain resists change. What is that all about? And I'm going to share some different science and research about how our brains were wired. So if you think back, thousands of years ago to when humans were first on the planet, life was very different. And we were being threatened by wild animals. We were living out on the land. We didn't have houses and cars that protected us from things like that. And we hadn't killed off large populations of some of the animals that might threaten our survival. So we as humans are not really well designed to, say, go up against a tiger or a bear. We don't have claws. We don't have hard shells. We don't have like a porcupine spine, quills on our bodies. We have to be able to run away pretty much to survive from certain kinds of predators. So evolutionarily, routines and the way our brain was designed were ways that helped us survive. The brain is designed to be very wary of making any type of changes because it's hard for our brains to know if something is safe. So our brains are wired to push us to stick with routines because your brain is constantly asking the question, what will keep me safe now? And so what will keep us safe now is probably a lot different than what would keep us safe several thousand years ago. But our brains are still wired to think, is there going to be a tiger or a bear or some large predator that's going to kill me? And that's the primary job of part of our brain. So in a basic understanding of the brain, we call it kind of a triune brain structure. So there's our reptilian brain, which is the part that just actually helps us do all of the things that we don't think about. It helps us breathe, our heart pumps and beats. And so that's where kind of all of our reflexes are placed, all of the things that our body does without us even thinking of it. So we're not talking about that part of the brain here. We're talking about the next structure up, which is our limbic brain, which has a lot of our emotions and our emotional processing in it, but it's also where habits get structured into the brain. Things that are going to make our lives easier, things that are also going to, from this perspective, keep us safe. So we're hardwired, again, to avoid threats to our survival. And in the past, those were much more plentiful and much more dangerous than what we have now. But threats like we have now are very different, right? So if you say a stressor, a big threat in terms of your mind, maybe you hate public speaking and you have a job and you have to give presentations at work. Like your brain is going to see that as a threat. Or maybe, it's just doing something like starting a new habit, starting to exercise. Our brain is actually going to perceive these new things as a threat. And then when it feels uncertain, your brain actually keeps focusing on that. It keeps focusing on, I don't know, is this safe? Is this dangerous? Is this going to potentially lead me to die? And we keep kind of spiraling into that. So then we just disengage from what we want to do with this new habit and we return to the old pattern. So we stop exercising or we try and get out of the work presentation that we don't really want to do. So one of the things also is that change requires more energy in the body and more energy specifically that the brain requires, which historically, again, if you think of 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, we had to conserve a lot of energy in our bodies because food wasn't as plentiful. We didn't just have the ability to drive up to a huge grocery store and buy anything that we wanted. Like we had to hunt and we had to gather for our food. So our brains were wired to conserve energy. And so doing something new, like making a change, was also going to burn more energy and potentially then put us in danger of starving. So it's very interesting when we start to understand this, right? When we start to understand why change is so hard is not because we suck, we don't have willpower, we're just a bad person, we're not committed, but part of it is actually our biology and how we're hardwired is to make us avoid change. So, habits take less energy for us to run, and they're in that second part of the brain that I talked about, which is called the limbic brain, specifically an area of that part of the brain called the basal ganglia. Well, things that require us to think things out, make new neural pathways, use attention and focus, they require the prefrontal cortex, which is more kind of this part of the brain that's above our eyebrows and our forehead area. That's our higher thinking brain. That's kind of the most logical, evolved part of our brain. So that takes more energy, effort, and attention. And so that part of the brain, if we're trying to do something new, is burning up a lot of energy, a lot of calories, a lot of resources. And so if we're still, and our brain is still staying in the way evolution was designed, it's like we don't want to use all of those calories and all of that energy. That could result in us starving because our brains still think that is a threat, even though for most of us in modern life it's not. Most of us are very unlikely to starve. So one way to kind of start to work with that is to activate our reward system in our brain, which many of you have heard of dopamine. It's kind of that addictive thing that can sometimes, the chemical involved in addictions, that sense of reward and satisfaction that we get from something. But it's also a good neurotransmitter because it helps us to, when we activate that reward system, when we get positive emotional experiences of making change, then we activate that dopamine response in the brain, and we're more likely to start to build a new habit and a new pathway. So I'll talk a little bit more about that particular piece and how we can tap into that. But I'm just going to continue a little bit with thinking about kind of the brain structure before we talk about ways to kind of hack our biology, in a sense, hack these old patterns and how we're wired so that we can make change. Because we all want to be able to make changes in our lives, I think, but we often are limited and restricted and frustrated by our biology that keeps kind of sabotaging us. So let's just talk about kind of the neurons and the pathways in the brain. So everything that we do, we feel, we think is all reflected in circuits of neurons in your brain. So that's the structure of the brain. There's different neural circuits. There's like that little gap, that little synapse that sends signals between. And when we do certain things over and over, we strengthen those pathways, we strengthen those circuits so that they fire more easily. It works more quickly and effectively and efficiently. And dopamine, which we were just talking about, actually reinforces these pathways. So it can, again, work to reinforce old pathways and old habits, but in the portion of wanting to change, we can also use dopamine to our advantage to reinforce new pathways and strengthen them and help them to become the predominant thing. So the more we do something, right, the more ingrained it becomes. It's kind of like driving a car down a dirt path. And if you drove that car back and forth, back and forth, back and forth down that same path hundreds of times, you start to wear into the earth. You wear that path deeper and deeper, and it becomes more ingrained. And that's what our brains do and our neural pathways do. They become ingrained and hardwired and more easily triggered the more they get developed. So new habits and new activities, we have to develop new neural pathways. And that we need the prefrontal cortex, that highest thinking part of the brain. And it also takes conscious effort, intention, and focus, right? So again, we're fighting against the brain's desire to conserve energy and resources when we're trying to create a new habit, and we're tapping into our prefrontal cortex of our brain. So what? Now I've given you a lot of information about how our brains work, how we're wired from an evolutionary perspective. So what do you do with this information if you want to be able to make change and not feel like you're a prisoner to those old pathways, those old habits, the old wiring of our brain? So one of the key things, I think, is to just know what things trigger you and push you into old habits. And often this has to do with like stressors and life situations that will make you default. So a great example that many people can relate to is you want to change your diet. You're having the intention of wanting to lose weight and be healthier through changing your diet. And then, you're around a particular person who pushes your buttons a lot. Maybe it's a family member. And so you default back into an old habit, which might be using food to help soothe your emotions and help you cope. So knowing that you have a trigger there can be very, very helpful in terms of realizing, okay, if I'm in this circumstance and then this person does what they usually do and they say certain things that push my buttons, I am going to be more likely to go and eat a cookie. So how can I use that knowledge and know that that's a trigger for me and not fall into that old habit? Just partly awareness of that is key, and then developing for yourself some sort of a strategy when you have that trigger activated so that you don't just fall into that habit and fall into that trigger, leading instantly to the habit. Another thing, and this feels connected to when we talk about triggers, is to lessen your stress, because stress, again, leads to coping behaviors. So when you're really stressed out, like when life is overwhelming for me, I want to eat chocolate. That's for me one of my coping behaviors and one of the things that makes me feel good. And probably some of the different chemicals in dark chocolate actually do benefit my brain in a sense. But when I do that unconsciously, because I'm stressed out, it's just like a unconscious coping behavior. I just grab a bar of chocolate and I start eating it. So we want to find ways to lessen our stress level, or when we are stressed, to release the stress from our body, so we're not just kind of sitting trapped and contained in that energy of stress. So things like exercise, meditation, mindful movement in the form of things like yoga, all of those things can be really beneficial. Learning something that I call, or that Body Talk, the system I practice, calls the cortices technique, which I'll maybe put a little link in the show notes, is another great, it's a technique that takes less than 2 minutes to do, and yet it can really lessen your stress in the moment, especially the more that you consistently use it. So having tools at your disposal so that you're not constantly in high stress and more likely to fall into coping behaviors and being triggered, and again, falling into old habits. These are some simple ways of starting to move past falling back easily into old behavior patterns when you're intending to make some changes for your own health. Another way is just to engage your prefrontal cortex by paying attention and noticing, oh, I'm having that desire to self-sabotage. You know, I said I'm going to eat healthy, clean foods, and now I'm like wanting to go buy potato chips or go through a drive-through someplace. I'm paying attention to that. I see that pattern. And then by paying attention, you can also steer your behavior in a different direction. Another great suggestion that I have for you is really to make sure you're starting out small, that you're using just baby steps. I was actually doing a podcast interview with somebody else. I was a guest on her podcast, and we were talking a lot about the importance of just making change realistic. So oftentimes we think that we have to go from, eating horrible foods, eating like processed foods, junk foods, fast foods, to instantly like, I'm going to just completely clean up my diet and I'm only going to eat natural things and vegetables and healthy meats if you eat meat. And, I'm going to just completely change that overnight. That's really not very realistic. And from a biological point, when we make changes that require willpower, we're actually using the chemical serotonin in our body to help us do that. And serotonin can deplete pretty quickly. So if you're trying to go from, 0 to 100 really quickly, you're going to deplete that serotonin. You're not going to have the willpower, and it's not going to last. Whereas if you say, okay, I'm going to make this change in increments. So first I'm going to just cut out eating fast food. If you eat fast food, I don't think many people who listen to this podcast probably do, but this is just kind of an example of if you were to want to make a huge lifestyle change and you go from eating something that's just completely unhealthy for you to a completely clean and balanced diet. So you would just start with one thing, like I'm going to cut out one meal a week of that. And then you succeed at that, and then you add something else in. If you want to start to exercise, okay, instead of saying I am going to exercise for 30 minutes every day, how about start out with 5 to 10 minutes and build up from there? And that's going to make it a lot easier to be consistent. And it's also easier on your body in cases like that. It's very hard sometimes if we're not used to something like exercise to push ourselves to 30 minutes, and our bodies are going to get tired as well as our willpower is going to lessen. So we can also help in this process by boosting serotonin in our body so that we can have more access to that chemical that helps our willpower. Going out and getting some sunlight, which, we're getting into winter, at least in the northern hemisphere, so it's a little more tricky. The part of the world I live in, it's often rainy, so sometimes, that can be tricky. But other things like exercise will boost your serotonin, thinking about happy memories and really reflecting on them, being in the energy of them. Massage is another thing that can boost your serotonin. Read up a little bit on serotonin and what is good for boosting your serotonin, and then see something that resonates for you and do that consistently, and then see if you start to feel like you have a little more willpower. So using these chemicals in our bodies for our own good. And then also finding ways to get support and reinforcement for the changes that you're making, because one of the things that's been shown by research is that when we get like somebody saying, good job, or you did a great job with your presentation, I'm so proud of you for making those changes. When we actually get that reinforcement, yes, it feels good, but it also helps to activate dopamine in our body, which we talked about in the beginning of the episode, and that reward system in our body. And then it basically makes us more likely to want to do that again, because we want that same feeling. We want that dopamine again. We want that sense of reward. So these are some ways that you can start to make some changes, and understanding how your brain is structured, how your brain is wired, and all the chemicals that are part of this process, how evolutionarily our brains haven't changed a whole lot from several thousand years ago. Yes, we have evolved, but at the same time, our brains are still thinking, if I decide to take up a new exercise routine, if I decide to change my diet, if I decide to meditate every day, our brain is actually wired to sabotage that because it thinks that's dangerous. I don't know. I've never done that before. Maybe you have, but you haven't successfully. So I'm going to try and sabotage that because I want to keep you safe. So what's coming through my mind now too is just take a moment and have gratitude for your brain and the way it's wired, and that it's always trying to keep you safe. It's always trying to keep you surviving. And when you notice that you're falling into an old pattern and an old habit, and you're thinking, I don't know, I don't know if I can keep up with this new change that I'm making. I don't know if I can keep exercising. This diet thing that's making changes and how I'm eating, it's really not very easy. Thank that part of your brain and say, I know you're trying to keep me safe, and I really appreciate that. You can even say basal ganglia, which is the area of the brain that's probably part of that, the habits and the patterns. But, I also know that this particular thing is not going to kill me. It's not going to kill me to stop eating that food that, I want to give up. It's not going to kill me to start exercising consistently. It's not going to kill me to start meditating, or whatever it is that you want to do. So thank you, brain, for trying to keep me safe. And I know that it's not. And tap into that other part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, and really use that power and that energy there of intention and focus and conscious effort. And when you want to give up, tap into that part of your brain and think about, why is it that I want to do this? Why is this important to me? Because sometimes that connection to our why, in many ways, in many different areas of our life, if we're doing something because we understand why it's important to us, then we can keep coming back to that. If we just say, oh yeah, I'm going to start exercising every day, but you don't really have a connection to your why, then it doesn't really fuel that part of your brain that will help you stay on track, and that you can come back to and remind yourself, oh yeah, I'm doing this because I know it will help me. It will help me improve my life. It will help me have more energy. It will help me be there for my kids. So journal out your why about whatever change you're going to make. Remember, keep it small and incremental, like baby steps. So what would be the first step to get to your big goal? Break it down into bite-sized pieces. I really want to enforce and emphasize that particular piece of advice, because it's so easy to jump into going from, completely never having exercise to thinking, I'm going to exercise every day for 30 minutes or an hour. And you're setting yourself up for self-sabotage versus, oh, if I just go for a 10-minute walk after work every day, then that seems much more doable, doesn't it? And once you do that 10 minutes and you start to feel good about it, and you notice what's happening in your body and how you feel, then you're more inclined to say, let's make it 15 minutes tomorrow. And then, you build up and you get to that goal much more quickly, and more likely for it to stick than to just say, oh, I'm going to just jump in with both feet. And again, I always also emphasize that sometimes we need support for making changes. We need someone to either help us become more accountable to ourselves and give us external accountability, or we need resources, things like making dietary changes. If you're somebody dealing with pain and you want to do like a elimination diet to try and figure out what's causing your pain, what foods make it worse, I wouldn't advise doing that without somebody helping you and supporting you, because a lot of these changes can be really challenging. And having somebody who knows the process and who knows resources and who knows strategies can really tremendously benefit you. So I hope this was a valuable episode. As always, I hope that you understand a little bit more why it is that it's hard to make changes, why it's challenging, and that you're not alone in that, and that it's actually your biology that makes that change hard. But more importantly, I hope you're empowered with some ways to start to think about, how can I make those changes in a way that's going to be lasting and sustainable, rather than just a quick flash in the pan that you're not going to stick with. And ultimately, then we feel bad about ourselves many times too when we don't succeed. When you made a resolution at New Year's and then you don't follow through, we often can feel really disappointed in ourselves, like, I did it again. I can't seem to follow through. So understanding and having forgiveness for yourself in the past, why it's been difficult, and trying to tap into resources and strategies that will help you make it doable in the future. All right. Thank you for taking the time to listen. And until next time, I will see you in health.